On a frozen river island in 1969, two nuclear powers came within hours of war. Not the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and China. Welcome to Shadow Archives. This is a story of a border incident so dangerous, it nearly triggered a nuclear war between two communist states and permanently changed the world. By 1969, the Soviet Union and China were no longer allies. What had once been the world's greatest communist partnership had collapsed into open hostility. They called each other traitors. The border between them stretched for 4,380 kilometers. Along that border, there were hundreds of disputed points. One of them was a small frozen island in the Ussuri River. On the morning of March 2nd, 1969, a Chinese People's Liberation Army unit ambushed Soviet border guards on Zhenbao Island. The attack was planned, coordinated, and deliberate. 31 Soviet soldiers were killed. The Soviet response was immediate and overwhelming. On March 15th, tanks and artillery returned to the island. The battle on the ice lasted for hours. By the time the fighting stopped, both sides had suffered significant casualties. But the real danger was not on the island. It was in Moscow. Inside the Kremlin, the KGB delivered a disturbing assessment. Intelligence suggested that China might attempt a preemptive nuclear strike against Soviet missile installations in Siberia before the Soviets could respond. The question being debated in Moscow was not whether to respond. It was whether to strike first, before China could. Defense Minister Andrei Grechko reportedly proposed a surgical nuclear strike against Chinese nuclear and military facilities. The plan was on the table. Brezhnev hesitated. He began discreetly probing Western governments, asking how they would react if the Soviet Union attacked China. The answer surprised him. In Washington, Nixon and Kissinger were watching closely. They concluded that a Soviet nuclear strike on China would be catastrophic, not just for China, but for the entire global order. They had to act. Through back channels, Washington quietly alerted Beijing. The Soviets are considering a nuclear first strike. China needed to know, and needed to reconsider its strategy. China reoriented its strategic calculus almost immediately. If the Soviet Union was a greater threat than the United States, then perhaps the United States was no longer the enemy. What ultimately prevented the nuclear strike was something almost absurd. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin tried to reach Mao Zedong by telephone. The Chinese operator refused to connect the call and hung up. In September 1969, Kosygin flew to Beijing for emergency negotiations. The two sides agreed to a ceasefire and to begin border talks. The nuclear option was quietly taken off the table. The fragile armistice held. The nuclear weapons stayed in their silos. But the world had changed, and almost no one knew it yet. Three years later, Richard Nixon arrived in Beijing. The visit was celebrated as a historic breakthrough in diplomacy. What was rarely discussed was why it happened, and what had made it possible. The Zhenbao Island incident had done what years of diplomacy could not. It had convinced China that the Soviet Union, not the United States, was its primary threat, and that conviction opened the door. An island of 0.74 square kilometers had triggered the greatest geopolitical realignment of the Cold War. Here is what the Zhenbao Island incident teaches. History does not turn on grand theories or inevitable forces. Sometimes it turns on a telephone operator who refuses to connect a call and a general who hesitates. Zhenbao Island is Chinese territory today. The Russians call it Damansky. Most of the world calls it nothing at all, because most of the world has never heard of it. But for 3 months in 1969, it was the most dangerous place on Earth. Next file, the plan to use a nuclear weapon that almost no one knows about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Every file in the archives matters. Subscribe and unlock the archives. New file every week. I will see you in the next one.